Yesterday, the government announced what is essentially a pretty strict ban on social media applications across, 10 of these major platforms for anyone under the age of 16. And this follows, a broadly similar policy introduced by the Australians a little while ago. And there are lots of other countries in Europe looking at this. So I thought, we could have a big rant about the pros and cons, but I don't feel like I really want to do that, right? So instead, let's look at the technical side of this. Let's look at, if you're implementing such a ban, how could you do it? Is it possible? And what would you do? The proposal from the government is that we don't want under 16s on certain platforms, let's say TikTok, right? And the reason for this is things like their addictive qualities, the infinite scrolling, problematic content, things like this. Given that, how do we actually implement a restriction, right? So let's have a think about how this setup works and where we could sort of, should we say, inject ourselves with some kind of block and see whether that would work. So, so a child is going to be going onto the internet using a phone or a laptop or something like this, right? So let's just draw a little phone in here, right? Okay, something like that. And their phone, when they're at home, will often connect to the internet through Wi-Fi, right? So this Wi-Fi will go to a home router, which will then go to their ISP, right, internet service provider. And this is broadly similar in any country. And so you could put blocks here, here, or here, and we can talk about that. But of course, if there is no router, then, or any Wi-Fi, then they might have a little 5G phone antenna, right? And all phones have a little thing sticking out the top. Do you remember those? And this is your 5G, and this goes to your phone company, right?
Telco.
Yeah, I couldn't remember the name. So, BT or O2 or whoever it is that does this. And then they want to connect to some problematic application. So some social media site they're not allowed to be on, right? So this is the server of the social media site, right, that's serving this content to this phone.
And servers still look like 1980s computers.
They do, yes. And now I have that on good authority that is the case. And then finally, this server will send data to one of these two like this, and it gets routed this way. So let's look at what we could do as a society or as individuals to prevent this kind of stuff, right? Let's first look at the kind of the data layer, right? So the actual connections that we've got here. We could put blocks on our home router, right? So for example, there's a technology called Pi-hole, which is mostly an advertising blocking, but it also does a lot of DNS filtering for other sites. You could use a Pi-hole as your DNS server, right? And block almost all of this traffic at source.
So as I remember it, DNS is domain name
yeah.
server.
And what it would essentially mean is that this would go, I would like to go to tiktok.com, and the router would go, there is no such address, when in fact there is, right? But it's just blocked it. The problem with this is that is technically, for most people, that's technically too difficult to set up, right? Yes, there are instructions online. Yes, lots of people watching this video might have one of these, right? But we're not making decisions at a societal level based on the people watching Computerphile videos, right? If only. We are making them across the broad average person who is not doing that, right? So blocking at the router level, I think, is unlikely to work because it's going to be too spiky across different people. My router might have good blocks on it, someone else's router might not.
It strikes me that the place here to do this is at the ISP, the internet service provider, or at the phone company.
Yeah.
Surely that's where you do it.
Well, because the other problem is that they're not always going to be on your router, right? They go to a friend's house or they go to a coffee shop with a different router that doesn't have any blocks on. If you put blocks on those routers, no one in the shop can go to those websites, right? And the adults might get cross. So you've got this distinction of the router doesn't know the age of the person connecting, and so what do we do?
But could it know the age of the person connecting?
I mean, in theory, there are mechanisms that exist to share the age of the device that's connecting, right? So for example, assuming you've put in your age correctly, your phone knows how old you are and could send that information. That is not, I would say, a hugely well-established protocol at the moment, but it could be something that we could do.
And the other thing I notice as a parent is that sometimes you pass your own phone to the child.
Yeah, and often the protection mechanisms on the phone are only down to a passcode and things like this, and it all gets a bit shaky. So let's talk about your ISP idea, right? So we could put blocks here and here. So we would say legally to all companies that offer internet access in the UK, block these sites. That is also pretty difficult to manage. First of all, the site list changes. Secondly, people use, people can use VPNs and other things to get around this. But also, again, you're not going to know who it is that's connecting. If this ISP is running the internet at a coffee shop with 50 connections, unless we've established a protocol across the country where every single device always sends the exact correct date, right, of your age, it's not really feasible. So the government legislation that's being proposed in the UK does not target these two options, right? So we're not doing it at home. We're not doing it on the ISP, right, on your internet service provider. So where else could we look? Well, the obvious one would be to target the device. And actually, these technologies already exist. Google offer Family Link and Apple offer Screen Time, right? These are two parent managing apps that allow you to control what a phone can do, what it can't do. So for example, on my daughter's phone, I can control who's on her contact list and things like this. This in a way would work quite well. Suppose a child only connected to the internet through a single device, which I realise is a stretch. If we had such a block on this device, then it would never serve these files because it would refuse to go to here, it would, and so it would never make the requests at all. And this is one way you could do this. The problem, I guess, is there's a couple of problems I can see with this. The first one is it requires this device to know exactly how old the person using it is. And people receive phones from family members. People who set up the phones might put in the incorrect date. I mean, literally, the age is basically defined when you first log into the phone. It says, what's your date of birth? Just put in 1901, incredibly old, access to all sites, right? That doesn't seem hugely foolproof, right? So that's not so good. The dominant operating systems that run on phones in this country are Android and iOS. You're putting a lot of onus on two companies to essentially be the gatekeepers for the entire internet for a whole generation, which is something we should consider before we do it, right? I think. So this is not where the government is going to target their changes. So where are they going to target changes? Well, there's only one box left, and it's this one.
We haven't actually put any humans on the other side of that. Of course, you could target the humans, technically. I suppose tell them they're not allowed.
Yes, good point. Right, so you could make this illegal for the parents. You could say, if your child goes on these sites, we're going to fine you £500, £1,000. You would find that fewer children go on the sites. Not everyone will be caught by this because it's very, very difficult to manage. And maybe we don't want to, for example, you have a current 15-year-old who's already using these websites and is determined to try and circumvent some rule. Do we really want to punish the parents for that? It's a difficult call. Politically, that's not what they're doing. They're saying it's a bit like drinking in the UK. So in the UK, you can buy alcohol when you're 18 or over. But it's not illegal to buy alcohol specifically. It's illegal to sell it. So they're saying they deal with the issue of underage drinking in the UK by saying don't sell alcohol to under 18s. But if an under 18 was caught with alcohol, they wouldn't go to prison or anything like this. Right? It doesn't work that way. So it's a general societal trend rather than a kind of punishment. There's only one left, and it's this one. What the government regulation is intending to do, and this is the same as the Australian system, is put some onus with the threat of big fines on the actual app providers or platform providers themselves. So this would be TikTok, Meta for Facebook, Snapchat, and so on. They are saying, don't serve your websites or your applications to under 16s. So now let's think about how they would do that on a technical level before we discuss, whether that can be done. There are a few ways. The easiest way, technically, but perhaps the most controversial way, would be some kind of government ID. In general, people don't like the idea. In this country particularly, we seem to be averse to digital IDs. Lots of countries have them already. But I would observe that the government has our data anyway, because we all have, a lot of us have passport numbers, we all have birth certificates, we're all registered and things like this, right? They know who we are. It's not inconceivable that you could have an API or some system, but basically one of these platforms could dial into and say, is this person over 16? There are some drawbacks. There's the data privacy one that people are worried about. There's also the fact that you could just use someone else's, I just put in your dad's details and raise your age, right? Something like this. So it's the existence of an ID alone is perhaps not sufficient, but it is a barrier. The actual legislation is based around this idea of they have to do a good job. Right? That's not the actual legal wording. They have to be seen to be putting in rigorous checks. What exactly those rigorous checks are up for debate. So let's look at some others. Interestingly enough, the Australians blocked any concept of using an ID to do this. So they said, we need you to check people's age, but you mustn't use an ID for privacy reasons, which in some sense hamstrings the one that could have worked, right? But which is why in Australia you have some problems with some of the other systems. What's the next one? The next one would be something like face recognition. There are computer vision models, AI, that are trained to age people, to say they are this old. I would say they are below 100% accurate, let's put it that way. I train these models, not face recognition models, but I train AI models all the time, and I don't think I've ever got 100%. It's just not how it works. So you're in a situation where a company that's developing a model to detect the age of someone from a photo has got to deal with the fact that children develop at rapidly different rates. In this country, we send children into shops to try and buy alcohol at 16 because they've already got a full beard. And so we see if the shops will check their ID as a test. And those children are getting through this filter. Right? I mean, they're 16, so it's probably all right. But you get the idea. This is very, very varied. And we found, in other countries that have tried to implement this, like Australia, there's reports of people just putting on a fake moustache and getting through the checks. These are just CNNs running, convolutional neural networks running behind the scenes. They're not that sophisticated. They've just got a lot of training data and they're hoping it works. I remain skeptical that this is the way to go. I certainly would argue that if your idea is rigorous checks, that is not sufficiently rigorous.
And also, isn't there a privacy issue there? So if you're worried about government ID being a privacy issue, then surely giving them your face information is...
They can say, well, we'll delete it straight away, but they always say that, right? Yes, that's exactly right. There is a question mark over this. So we could go with some other sort of non-ID age verification. So for example, a credit card. So the idea would be you put a credit card detail in, the existence of a credit card, you have to be a certain age, implies that you are above some threshold. We can all accept that it's possible to get hold of a credit card being younger by just going in your parents' wallet or something like this.
It is, but also my children have both had Revolut accounts with credit card information since they were 14.
Yeah, so different debit cards and credit cards might count differently, but certainly the cards that a 16-year-old has, you could plausibly assume that a 15-year-old might also have those cards. So I don't think it's hugely compelling. It might add with this, but then how many hoops are you trying to make people jump through? It's difficult. The way that it's currently done, for example, for the things that are restricted to 18-year-olds, as well as in Australia, is third-party ID checkers. Right? So there's a company called Yoti, for example, that does this. There are lots of other companies. Yoti do identification checks using licenses, passports, other details. They then store that information. That person and that account are now old enough. And then these companies can ask Yoti for a challenge token, essentially, to say, are they the correct age? They can basically say, how old is the person that we're talking to? Yoti goes into its database, or some other company goes into its database and retrieves that information. Now, I struggle to decide what the difference between that and the government ID is, right? But everyone hates the government ID version and doesn't mind the Yoti version. But ultimately, this is still a data provider. They have data on you, which is then served out on request. So it's not a perfect system, but it's currently the system that kind of works. One option would be to have the phone provider do this. So for example, as we already said, Apple and Google phones typically know how old the person is anyway. They could just be they could just perform that role. So you go to tiktok.com, TikTok asks a device, how old is the person using this device? It responds, and then TikTok changes its policy accordingly. That is probably as good as the Yoti system. I guess the benefit is that you already have the phone, so it kind of all fits into one thing. But you have the same problems we've had before, that arguably you could lie about your age.
Or you might have received the phone from a family member who set it up, and therefore it's got their data.
And so I think the important thing to understand about this, these are basically all things I can think of. There are probably others that I've forgotten. I think the thing to understand about this is, and to be fair to the government, right, which, controversial, I think they recognise this is not perfect. This is not a perfect system. It cannot be a perfect system. The only perfect system would be everyone has some kind of barcode tattooed on their hand, and there's someone sitting over your shoulder all the time to make sure you don't accidentally use someone else's barcode or on purpose, it's not really plausible. If you're determined to lie about your age, to steal someone's credit card, right, to put a fake moustache on, yes, you will get around these things. If you do it based on location, use a VPN, you can get around these things. I think that's accepted. That doesn't necessarily mean you should not try, because there are some measured harms from social media, and so maybe we should do something about that. Right? That's the debate that's being had. What I've come around to thinking is that maybe this ends up being a bit like drink driving rules in the UK, which is that at the time everyone was like, "Oh, this is a load of old nanny state nonsense," and still drank and then drove for a while. But over time, society shifted, and now we basically don't consider it a thing. We look down on anyone that does it, right? It doesn't mean that someone who's determined to do it won't. On average, the vast majority of people don't do it and don't think it's a good idea. And so you could argue that by doing things like this, over time, we slowly move society to a point where it's just assumed you don't go on these things until you're 16, just like you don't smoke, you don't drink until you're 18, and so on, right? It will take time to know whether that's going to be the case. I don't know. One of the criticisms is that it might prevent people from visiting legitimate and perfectly reasonable sites to get information on, let's say, hobbies or other, like-minded people doing certain things. Fair enough. I don't think those platforms, to be fair, are in range of these. So this is really targeting the very big companies. But what I would also say is that these companies and everyone has an opportunity to develop safe internet spaces for children. Right? That doesn't seem to me to be a hugely controversial request. So, for example, YouTube is on the cards to be restricted, but YouTube Kids is not. And you would say, because you have children of a certain age and so do I, that YouTube Kids doesn't have all the content on, perhaps it should, but maybe that's the opportunity. Maybe if you make YouTube Kids as good as YouTube for kids, then they don't even care about going on YouTube. Right? That will be the biggest win for me, I think. So this is a very, very difficult problem. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it turns out. I would say that lots of countries are looking at this. I think the idea that we can say this isn't manageable and we should let the tech companies do what they want isn't going to fly long term, because I think most parents are okay with this. Right? They want some protection mechanisms in, and they're going to try and see it done.
I read that it was 90% of parents said 90%.
And that consultation might be self-selecting, right? So what over the whole populace, I don't know, but Australia did a whole populace study, and the support was very, very strong. Right? I think as a society, we don't think children are well served by social media right now, and I don't think the social media companies have been seen to be particularly proactive in doing anything about this. Now they have to. Right? And so maybe that's not such a bad thing. Post-quantum is algorithms that are robust to quantum attack. Right? So we have a bunch of cryptography that underpins most of what we do, for example, online, or on any computer system, really. And a lot of this is quite vulnerable to specific attacks if a quantum